I am Joan Gore, and I am moderating the AIEA Digital Archive Series. The word archive sounds a little scary because it makes us sound very old, but what it really is a series designed to interview the second generation of leaders in the United States in higher education who've helped to transform American international higher education. The first generation from World War II to the 90s, and the second generation from the 70s and 80s until now. I'm very pleased to be talking with Dr. Gilbert Merkx this morning. Dr. Gilbert Merkx is the Director of International Education at Duke University. Tell me the correct name.
Well, I'm the Director of the Center for International Studies.
Center for International Studies at Duke University. I apologize for getting that wrong. Previously was the Vice President for International Affairs at Duke, has had a very long and varied career as a sociologist working especially in Latin America and Scandinavia, and has had a long history with AIEA as well. And so I think that this conversation will give us some sense of breadth of change in American higher education over the last several years. So Gil, I'm going to start not so much with your past, and we'll go back to that, but with your present. I know that you and Raul Nelson are publishing this year a book on internationalization. I wonder if you could tell me the working title and what it's about and what you're thinking. We're starting with you now and the future.
So the book is called, we're tentatively calling the book Internationalizing the Academy, Lessons from Leadership. And it should be coming out from the Harvard Education Press this fall. That's a division of the Harvard University Press. And the core of the book are 10 chapters. Each one is a narrative of a career of a former senior international officer. And then the book has those narratives, including my narrative and Raul Nolan's narrative, are bookended by opening chapters in which I discuss the general history of international education in the U.S., and then Raul talks about, from an anthropological perspective, the role of the SIO. And then at the end of the book, we draw lessons from the 10 stories, the 10 career histories, not just about what the career arc and what people learn from their careers, but also about the current state of international education. And so that's pretty exciting. We're just working now on the last chapter, and we hope to send it to Harvard next week. So it's going to be hot off the press.
That's very exciting, and it's a wonderful foundation reading for anybody who's interested in these digital archives as well, and probably something that we should make note of on the archive site as we build it.
Well, you're certainly welcome to do so, and we would be happy to have it.
Excellent to have that as a companion piece, and so we'll talk about that at AIEA.
Well, this project started because one of the things that came out of a conversation I was having with Raul about the fact that much of the most interesting information you get at an AIEA meeting is not what's on the panels, it's what people say in the hallways.
Yes.
That's when you tell the real story of what happened or why you stepped down or why you're moving and what happened to somebody else, and you're getting the inside dope on the politics of being an SIO. And you hear the stories of failure as well as the stories of the panels are all about success stories, but then the hallways talk about failures.
Right.
So the idea was to have people tell the full story, the successes and their failures.
Excellent.
And in these narratives. And then as we worked on this project, we began to see that it wasn't just about success and failure. It's really about the context, the evolution of American higher education in some sense. And
yes.
This is the real subject.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that leads us to the beginning of your career.
Okay.
Not that you've been here for the entire evolution of American higher education, but you as a scholar initially, working in international areas, and then as a scholar who moved into the whole idea of global education and globalization, trying to probably struggle with what that means, how it means, how it functions in the real world on campuses, etc. Really have transformed your own career as well as transforming international education. Can you talk a little bit about how you got started and how you got into this area?
Well, I have there are really two stories. The story of my own particular life, which happens to have international dimensions. And then there's the story of my professional career, which as another layer of international dimension, but I happened to be born in South America, Venezuela. My mother was a school teacher from Nebraska who went to teach in the American school in Maracaibo, Venezuela during the Depression. My father was a Dutch ship's captain who was in charge of tanker traffic from Lake Maracaibo to the Dutch West Indies.
Wow.
And they met there and got married, and I was
Sounds
born
like a
there.
romance story,
It's a
actually.
very romantic story.
Yeah.
So I was born in Maracaibo, and we lived in the Dutch colony, the Shell colony, which was Dutch. But we lived in Venezuela, which was Spanish, and then my mother was an American, and she and my father agreed that their kids would be raised as Americans, even though we were living in the Dutch colony. So I grew up speaking Dutch, English, and Spanish.
Wow.
And then when I was 11, my father retired. We moved to a small town in Oklahoma. So I went.
That must have been culture
It was
shock.
a total culture shock. I hated it. But I went from living in a colonial childhood at the age of 11 to a small town in western Oklahoma, which was a forced introduction into American teenage culture. And so I had that 6 years in Oklahoma, junior high school and high school, and I just wanted to get out. And the furthest place in my imagination was Harvard, so I applied to Harvard, and I lucked out, I got in. So I went to Harvard. And when I finished Harvard, I was kind of curious about going back to Latin America, so I applied for a Fulbright. And I applied to go to Peru because that year Peru gave the most Fulbrights. So I went back to study anthropology in Peru at the age of 21. And that really began my professional career because I realized that I was fascinated by modernization, poverty, social change, and that's what I wanted to study. And at that time, anthropology mostly studied Indians, native peoples, and I really wanted to study modernization.
Right.
So I switched to sociology, and I applied in Peru, and I was given a fellowship to go to Yale, so I got my PhD at Yale. I did a dissertation about Argentina. I was kept on at Yale on a tenure-track job. But at Yale, I was teaching public health and sociology of public health, epidemiology, and as well, and all this stuff. But I really wanted to work on the research on the third world. So
Right.
I left Yale, I went on the market, and I ended up in New Mexico, which hired me to teach about Latin America. So that was my first change. And then
So you made big changes because of your commitment to things international.
because of my commitment to big things. And then the second career change happened around, well, then what happened is, you may recall the Vietnam War period when there were all these demonstrations and stuff.
Quite well.
And when I first went to New Mexico, I was asked by the students in a little small radical club there if I would be their faculty sponsor, because nobody else would sponsor them. They needed a sponsor to be official student group, and it was called Students for a Democratic Society. And little did I know what I was getting into.
Yes.
So I agreed to be their faculty sponsor, and then as that group got more and more radical and violent, I got in more and more trouble, not because I agreed with them, but and eventually they threw me off as their advisor because I was too moderate for them. I didn't agree with what they were doing. But by then, I had been hauled up to the state legislature to testify on a lot of other stuff. So in 1972, I decided I would go to Sweden. I'd already studied Swedish in graduate school. I spoke Swedish, and I'd been to Sweden. In fact, I'd worked in the Latin American Center at Stockholm University for several summers. So I applied for it, and I got a job in Sweden, and I spent a year there. And I discovered a couple things. I thought that I loved Sweden as a country, but I'd only been there in the summertime.
Oh, yes.
And I discovered that Sweden is a wonderful society, but it's a very boring society, and that I missed the hurly-burly and the diversity and the conflictual politics of the United States. And
Right.
this
Although
was the
today it
center.
probably is not the same, but then
It's
it
not
was.
the same, but then it was very, very polarized.
Homogeneous, yeah.
So I decided to come back, and I realized that if I was going to help to change the world, it would be better to be part of the United States than part of Sweden. So I came back to New Mexico, where I still had tenure, and then in 1980, they asked me to become director of the new Latin American Institute. So, and that started me off on a whole other career as administrator, going to Washington, getting involved in coalition politics to fund international education programs in general. I began working to build a coalition, not just of various studies people, but of study abroad people and the language, building bridges to the language community, to the humanities community, and so forth. And so, as that process went on, I found out eventually, and I'd already been doing this before AIEA was started, but I found that AIEA started up.
Right.
And so at their second meeting of AIEA in Washington, when Jack Vanderwater was the president of their
Yes.
second conference, I was invited to be a speaker and talk to them about my approach to international education coming from area studies. So I came, and there were 65 people in the audience, and that was AIEA, and we had a wonderful conversation. That was great fun. And after that, I visited came various times. I couldn't belong because in those days you could have only one person per institution join AIEA. There already was somebody else from New Mexico who had joined, so I couldn't be part of AIEA. But later, when I went to Duke, I immediately Duke, and nobody had signed up, so I signed Duke up,
Right.
and I became a regular member. And now we've opened it up, so you don't have to be the only person. There can be 3 or 4 people in an institution. And I found AIEA was a wonderful organization, and I've been a faithful participant ever since.
And yes, you have been, and you're quite well known in the organization. The organization and probably your career have followed parallel trajectories in terms of how things have developed. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about in your career, and especially moving from New Mexico to Duke, and reflecting back on how internationalization was defined at that period, how it's different from how it is defined today, perhaps, and what the struggles were to help it grow.
Well, I began as an historical sociologist, so I have a kind of historical perspective on international ed. International education, as we know it today, really goes back and was inspired by different things that happened during and after World War II.
Right.
So during World War II, we had to have a lot of people who spoke a lot of different languages that the Defense Department or the War Department had no idea about. And the only place, and we had to train a lot of officers and enlisted personnel very rapidly in those languages, and to learn something about the foreign countries where they were going to be fighting or where they were going to be occupying territory. So the Army set up the Army Specialized Training Program, and they sent 400,000 officers to be trained. The only place they could be trained was on campuses. So during World War II, campuses all over the country started training programs in area studies and languages for Army personnel, and the Navy did the same thing. They call it the V-12 program. So you had Navy programs because we were training Seabees and Marines to go fight in the Pacific and places, North Africa and places. So that was the start of university-based foreign language and area studies program with federal support. And that model was pulled out of the closet and refunded after Sputnik when the National Defense Education Act. It was the same model. Instead of having federal training programs, you had a collaboration between higher education and government to provide training for the national interest. So that's one thing that happened. Second thing that happened is after World War II, there was a lot of we had loaned a lot of equipment, which we knew we would never get back, to the Allies, to India, to England, to France, and so forth. And their currencies were weak and the dollar was strong, so they couldn't really, there were all these currencies that they owed us money, but we didn't really want their currency, and there was these big piles of blocked currency sitting around. So Senator Fulbright came up with the idea of allowing them to pay us back by spending those blocked accounts on American scholars coming to their countries. So that this was the origin of the Fulbright program, so that we would send scholars to teach in England or India. They would be paid with these blocked currency funds. And then we, in turn, we would provide some money to bring them here. They would pay for the airplane tickets and we host them at American universities. So the Fulbright exchange program began, was tremendously successful. And it was so successful when the currency ran out, everybody kept funding it anyway. So that was faculty exchanges. And the next thing that happened is the faculty who went abroad met people, knew the universities. They began to realize they could take students with them to these places because now they had the connections, the networks. So they began to have study abroad programs and go back to these countries where they were Fulbright scholars and taking students with them. So that's how study abroad starts. And the reverse thing is that the faculty members who've been in the United States now had American context, so they began to send their students to the U.S. to get degrees. So you began to get foreign students coming to the U.S., which had never happened before, and you began to get American students studying overseas. So you began to get this exchange going back and forth, and this is a function, again, of what happened after World War II. The other thing that happened was, after World War II, Europe was devastated, so we had the Marshall Plan. And then the Marshall Plan was, which was providing aid to European countries to rebuild their economies. And then that was so successful that we started the Point 4 program and other forms of aid program, which eventually became the AIE programs, Agency for International Development. And we took the idea of the Marshall Plan and applied it to the whole world. So, and that meant that we were now providing technical assistance to help economic experts, agricultural experts, to help economies develop worldwide. And that starts the Board of International Food and Development Assistance Programs of the Department of Agriculture, which all the big state universities like Michigan State and Oklahoma State and Kansas State were all involved with. So that's another huge involvement of American universities and overseas projects. And so that's kind of where it begins. And then all of these things are so successful that they grow wildly. And if you look at the number of students studying abroad, the number of foreign students coming here, these numbers just go right up logarithmically. And that's a kind of discovery phase. That was what we were doing, putting these programs in place when AIEA was begun. And then gradually we all got to know each other, and we realized that all these events, all these activities interface and could support each other. They're all good for each other. Mm-hmm. And so so we began to see the need for overall campus coordination, and you began to get chief international officers or senior officers who could find the synergies among these programs. But I would have to say that that was, in a way, in retrospect, the easy phase. Because that was the stuff that was high payoff, it was relatively easy to do, it was very visible. But actually integrating and benefiting from these programs once they're well established is much harder. And that's the stage right now, is what do we do next?
Really good point.
And what we haven't done is we have made a lot of international activities become part of the American College and University, but we have not really internationalized the American College and University. And what we're talking about there is we need to do in the 21st century what happened at the end of the 19th century, which is at the end of the 19th century, the curriculum of American higher education changed from the classical curriculum to what they called the new curriculum. The classical curriculum, you studied Greek and Latin, and you studied ancient history. In the new curriculum, you studied French and German, and you learned European and American history.
Right.
And you switched from studying the Greek classics to the Western European and American classics. And so, and that's the curriculum that I had as an undergraduate at Harvard, and you probably had. Because you learn European languages and European literature, and European history and American history, and that was the new curriculum. But now we live in a globalized world, so we need world history, not European history. We need other languages besides European languages. We need to think globally and not just across the Atlantic. And that's proven very hard to do because the curriculum change is very difficult. There are many entrenched interests. Coordinating across different parts of the university is very hard to do. And I think we have lost some momentum, and I think individual institutions have done a good job of doing this, particularly in some colleges have done a great job. But we haven't really fundamentally changed the American University in terms of its core curriculum. And I think that is the next challenge, and it's going to be a hard one.
You know, you're absolutely, I'm really interested in your saying that. I taught at the University of Virginia 35 years ago. Mm-hmm. And then I actually went back later in my career for a short period of time, and I had children grown up who were going to the university. And as they were planning their schedules, I thought this is going to be so different from when I was teaching there, but it wasn't. It was very similar. And that doesn't mean they haven't done a wonderful job now, because my children are grown up. But it was so interesting to see that the fundamental core was the same, and how difficult it is to change that core. And changing academic content is very difficult because of great resistance, I think, still today to interdisciplinary development and change, and to also the idea of encroachment.
Encroachment. Everybody wants to defend their turf.
Right, the silo system.
Right, it's all siloed. And the other thing there's another structural weakness in American higher education, which is that there's so much administrative turnover at the top, and you know, if you've been at UVA, you've seen this fighting going on between the trustees and,
of course,
and the administration.
Right, and the president,
And the president, and this means that there's a high turnover of presidents and provosts even at the very best universities. And when that happens, it really undercuts the work of the senior international officer, because then they lose their leader, and whatever the last president's invested has to be, you have to reinvent that, you have to re-persuade, you have to hope you have a new champion. And quite frequently, the new president does not want to take on the initiative of the old president, they want to do something different.
Right.
So if the old president was pushing international, then the new president does not. And so this is a theme that's come up again and again of senior officers, that they're doing a wonderful job, and all of a sudden there's a change at the top, and they're out in the cold. And it just happens overnight. Right. And that's again a function of the politics of American higher education in this particular climate moment.
Right. Well, something that has always interested me, because I've done so much of my work on the study abroad side, has been that regardless of how you count the numbers, the percentage of students who go abroad from American higher education, who are enrolled in American higher education, remains at about 3%, even though the numbers have grown.
The absolute numbers have grown, but the percent of the total is we're obviously, we've shown that we can do it, but we're only doing it for a small proportion. And that's a shame, that's a huge loss. Because everything we know is that study abroad is a transformative experience.
It is.
And if you can extend that experience to most students, well, I mean, at Duke, about half of our students now study abroad. And that would be a reasonable goal for any university to try to achieve, and yet it's usually honored than breached.
It also means, and this is something I just have a personal interest in and have had for many years, 97% of the American student undergraduate population does not go abroad. Which means if we're talking really about internationalization on a campus, we're talking about what can we do on a campus to internationalize their experience.
We have to make the campus environment more international also. And that, I think that first and foremost means changing the curriculum, but also means changing the environment, the ambience. And I think that's one reason I'm very strong for having international students on one's campus, because that does make the environment more international.
Right.
But I think we have one thing in our favor, that despite the resistance of the educational structures to this change, is that globalization is on our side. Globalization is pursuing whether we want it or not.
Right.
And the people who will be most successful in the globalized world will be the people who speak the foreign languages, who have the overseas experience, who are comfortable in being global citizens, and who can relate well to people in other cultures. And those are going to be the winners. And the countries that do this as countries will be more successful than countries that are parochial. And so I think that this will inevitably give a greater priority to internationalizing our education, because as a country we have to do that. And eventually this message will sink home and will be in institutions that do more and more of that will be more and more rewarded. Goucher College, for example, about 6 or 7 years ago announced that they were going to make study abroad mandatory. Right. And the next year their application rate doubled.
Wow.
Everybody wanted that. People, oh my God, this is where I want to go.
Right.
And so if you really commit to it, you can get a payoff in the academic marketplace. Students want to go to a place where they know they'll get that.
Right. Well, in talking about trying to do comprehensive internationalization on American campuses, what does that mean? Is it curriculum development? If it's curriculum development, does that mean faculty development? Is there support for faculty development? If there are mission statements in presidential and institutional missions, does that help, or does that not mean anything?
Yeah, everything you say, it all helps, including giving faculty members some credit for being international and doing international work.
Which only in 4%, I know this statistic now, it probably has changed a little bit, but from research I've done, 4% of American higher education institutions about a decade ago counted international experience toward tenure. It's stunning.
It's stunning. Isn't that stunning?
Yeah.
3% of our students study abroad, 4% of our faculty get rewarded for doing global international things.
Now, it's probably better now, but I'm not sure it's
I don't think it's any better. I presented to when I was at Duke, the provost who I reported to had previously been the vice provost for international affairs, and when he was the vice provost, they developed a strategic plan for internationalization. So he asked me to do a new plan. So we took the old plan, we worked off that, we had committees, we worked for about a year, and we came up with a plan. I said, okay, here's the draft. And he read it. He said, well, this is very good. He said, but there are 2 or 3 things here I can't support. And I said, well, what about them? And I said, well, one of the recommendations is that international experience be counted towards tenure and promotion. And I looked at him and I said, Peter, I said, I didn't write that recommendation. You wrote that recommendation when you were the vice president.
Oh my gosh.
And he sort of biased a little bit. He said, you know, that was then and this is now. I wasn't the provost then, now I'm the provost. I don't want to take the heat.
Wow, that's so interesting.
And he said, well, you know, we just had women in here last year. They wanted gender to be a consideration for tenure. And I told them they couldn't do it. And I can't, if I turn down gender, I can't accept internationalization. But
wait.
Wait.
I'm sorry, as a woman, I don't think they're the same thing.
I don't think that's it. So anyway, and I think that's this kind of standard attitude, that you feel that, you know, that somehow this is lowering the standards by including international capability or experience or
frustrating that that's still the case.
So anyway, but it's a tough fight, and we have to just keep fighting it. But it all comes together. I mean, if you have, you know, there are so many rewards for the faculty in being international, colleagues overseas. You know, you get bored going to the same, you know, state or local conference. It's fun to go to a conference in another country, and then you get used to dealing with students from other countries. It's a bigger student pool, so I think it's coming, but it's coming so much more slowly. I thought 20 years ago, as I got an international education, that we'd be there.
Yeah.
And we're not. We're just inching forward, is what it feels like to me. So
Right.
It's not going to happen during my career, but I think it must happen eventually. It has to happen.
Yeah, I think it's probably the generation after us that
Yeah.
will be the people who will move this
Yeah.
along. And I think your comment that globalization will take us there whether we want to go or not is probably the case.
I think it's the
And
case.
it's maybe not always brilliant, the strategies that are used, or they may be challenging, like overseas campuses, that are not always successful, but sometimes are. But I guess it inches us forward.
I think everything we do helps in this long-term process. And so even if an institution falls back in the game, they may move forward again under new leadership.
Right.
And the institutions that do things very well and get rewarded for it become models for others. And so I would say on balance, where we see the growth of AIEA kind of reflects the growth of, in some sense, of our general
Right.
movement
And
forward.
there are hundreds of people at this
There are hundreds of
conference.
people at this conference. If we got 100 people in the beginning, that was good, and then 200 people was good. And I think the first AIEA conference that I went to from Duke, there were 240 people then, and they thought that was okay.
Yeah.
So the field is growing. There are more and more institutions that are hiring senior international officers. They're trying to do it. They're talking the talk. They may not be walking the walk yet, but
Or paying the dollar.
but we're getting there. I still feel generally optimistic, but I think we have to be honest about the fact that we're not nearly there yet.
Well, let me ask you, not just to look forward in that way, but to look at your own career and maybe talk about some of the things that you did at these different institutions that worked, that might be models for working going forward.
Well, I think that a lot of what I learned was just how to be an effective agent of change.
Mm-hmm.
And every institution is a different culture from every other institution. And so at the University of New Mexico, it was fairly anarchic, it was fairly decentralized. Relations between the center administration and the faculty were not good. There was a lot of distrust in the faculty part. And and then the president who appointed me to my first administrative job was very supportive, and then he got fired through no fault of his own. It was a basketball scandal, and he fired the athletic director who let the coach change the grades, and then the president of the Board of Regents was a friend of the athletic director. He fired the president, so I lost my backer. And then after that, I knew it was a matter of cultivating the faculty, of building a center that had so much faculty support and was seen as so useful that the administration wouldn't want to touch me. So to keep the administration happy, I wrote a lot of grants and brought a lot of money in, and to keep the faculty happy, I involved them, and many of the grants I wrote were to get money for their projects and ideas. And I set up an elaborate committee structure so the faculty would make all the decisions, and I basically played the role of an enabler to advance all kinds of activities involving Latin America at that point, including study abroad, including research overseas, including collaborations, exchanges, all this stuff. And it worked quite nicely, but it was exhausting because I was going back and forth to Washington, back and forth to Santa Fe, to the state legislature. I was writing to New York to the foundation. I was writing proposals all the time. And I built this shop up from a staff of 3 people to a staff of 50 people, from an MA program which had only one applicant to one that had 335 MA students, and from a budget of $60,000 to a budget of about $2 million annually. And so it was
That's quite
very
a change.
exciting. It was real change. And then when I left, when then Duke sort of brought me in, they were interested in my wife and they discovered about me, so they brought us both in. And I was then charged with trying to do something similar for all of Duke. Duke had already done a lot of very good things, so it was much easier lifting. And
What was your first position at Duke?
Vice Provost for International Affairs. So I, all of a sudden, instead of having Latin America in my portfolio, I had the whole world,
Yeah.
which was great. But the operation I left behind in New Mexico deflated very rapidly because there was nobody there to do all the hard work. And everybody sort of thought the money would always be there, but I had hustled for the money, and when I left, nobody else hustled for it, and the staff went down from 50 people and about 10 people, I think.
Yeah.
And but at Duke, it was my first years that were wonderful, and they were just really exciting, and we had a lot of good things happening. One of the things I was able to do was to bring AIA to Duke.
Mm-hmm.
So when the association came up
Which
with
is
bids,
now where it is.
which is now where it is. So I was able to bring it to Duke and give it quarters and provide it a lot of support,
Yeah.
and AIA took off. And Darla was the first person that I hired for that job, but she was the second person.
Mm-hmm.
She did very well. So that was wonderful. And then after about 10 years, the provost that had hired me lost interest in all the stuff that he brought me in to do. He decided the future was going to be in having overseas campuses.
Yes. Yeah.
So I said that was, we disagreed about it. I said that's a mistake. We should have overseas partnerships, not Duke standalone campuses. And he said, well then, I don't want you as vice provost because that's what I'm going to do. And I said, fine. And I understand you're the provost, I'm not, and so you should pursue your vision. And he did that. And it's, all I can say is it has not been as successful as predicted.
It's very challenging.
And I'm glad that I played no role in it because I thought it was a flawed model to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Is that when you went to the Center for International Studies?
And that's, well, I'd already been, I was the director all along.
Okay.
But then I went, I dropped
As
the
that,
vice provost
right.
and I just taught in sociology and ran the center.
Right. And what is your work like with that center? Because that's kind of the nuts and bolts of making these changes.
Well, I think the center at Duke, unlike the center at UNM, has an endowment, so it has enough money to run on its own, so I don't have to spend all my time raising money. And right now, my main interest is really what I would call theorizing globalization. I'm really interested in having the center think about the issues that the other centers don't think about. So the Center for Asia Pacific Studies, or the Center for Latin American Studies, or the Center for Russian Eastern European Studies are thinking about what's happening to their regions with globalization. But they're not thinking about globalization itself.
Right.
And so our center has become more and more focused, at least under my leadership, on the question of what is globalization, how is it working, who are the winners and losers, how do we theoretically understand it and predict, ultimately we'd like to explain it or predict what's happening. And so that's what my own personal work is now. I'm working on I've found a line of theoretical inquiry that I think is fruitful, based on the work of a Romanian physicist, who happens to be a colleague of mine at Duke, and essentially he has a theory about the establishment of flow systems or networks, and everybody's now talking about globalization as a kind of network, expansion of networks. And this other theory this guy's using for natural flow systems, I think applies to globalization. So I'm working on that. That's a nice little project.
That's interesting, yeah.
And we have to see how far I can push it out.
Right.
It goes.
Right. And that again brings us back to your book with Ryle Nolan. And that is really taking a look both back but also forward. Are there some lessons learned that you want to share at this point? Or are there challenges you see going forward
Well,
that you think are really
I
big?
think we have to be realistic about the obstacles, but we have to be idealistic about we have to be realistic about the obstacles and idealistic about the goals. But then I think we also have to recognize that we can make a difference. That we are change agents. That's a term John Hyle uses that I like. Senior International Office of Change Agent. Somebody has to be the advocate. Somebody has to be trying to make it happen. And that's what we do. And we're not the power brokers. We don't have the authority of the dean or the provost or the president. But we're well positioned to know everybody and to build coalitions and to persuade people that this is the way to go. And that's what we do. And we learn to get better at it as we do it. And I think that's partly what AIEA does. It's a forum for us to get together and swap techniques and clues about how to do this job. It's just a little tricky.
Right.
And that help us be better at it. And then if you go as far as you can, if you do as much as you can do in one institution and suddenly things are negative, you can always go somewhere else and try again.
Right.
And so you take the experience you have in one institution, you apply it in another institution. And that's what happened to me. I left New Mexico where I learned a lot. I went to Duke and I could put it right to work.
Right.
And so I think that I believe in what we do. I just think it's turned out to be a lot harder than I thought it would be, but I still believe in it.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful way to conclude our discussion because you've done a lot to bring us to where we are. So thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure to be with you on this conversation.
Thank you.